Well, thanks very much for inviting me, Thorsten, and I hope everyone enjoys the interaction. I've actually got everything on notes, and I know that this is Zoom, so I will probably end up looking as if I'm looking at my notes all the time. But I hope that you'll still enjoy it because it's very much a story in the form of a drama, and certainly one of my favorite episodes in the Gospels. So I'll just dive straight in, and then I'll probably talk for about half an hour, and then basically open it up for discussion. In my understanding, this event took place during Jesus's penultimate Jerusalem ministry around mid-October of the year before his crucifixion. This places the event at the pivotal point of the Jewish liturgical calendar, when the Torah readings of the old year end in Deuteronomy 34 with the death of Moses, and the readings of the new year begin again with Genesis 1 and the story of creation. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that this story does lend itself very well to the format of a drama. And my reading taken from John chapter 8, verse 2 to 11 will emphasize that aspect. So I'm going to read it now, but I'll read it as if it's a play. So, Act 1, the dawn raid. At dawn, Jesus appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. Act 1, Scene 2. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the crowd and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses said, we should stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Act 1, Scene 3. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Act 2, an unexpected twist. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Act 2, Scene 2. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Act 2, Scene 3. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Act 3. Victory without a shot fired. Act 3, Scene 1. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." The first question that comes to a modern person's mind, well, maybe more strictly to a heteronormal 20th century person's mind, like me, rather than a truly 21st century gender-neutral person's mind, would surely be the following. Where was the man? If indeed, as was being claimed, the woman had been allegedly caught in adultery, then she would have been in the embrace of her sexual partner, So, since the Mosaic law being referred to here was applied to both of the people involved in the adultery, there should have also been a man dragged into the scene with the woman. However, only the woman was handled in this way, with the man seemingly getting a free pass. This outcome must surely represent yet another example of unjust misogyny. So in answer to this first question, where was the man? I would say that this incident has all the hallmarks of a well-orchestrated sting operation. In that case, the man in question was in all likelihood playing a pre-rehearsed role in some elaborate scheme of entrapment. So, but the second question, I guess, is in terms of this misogyny. The reality is that from antiquity, the bias in our power structures against women has been palpably evident in many societies and persists even in our supposedly postmodern world today. So a follow-up question by a 21st century social activist, social justice activist perhaps, would be, why didn't Jesus just call them out? Jesus would certainly have been fully justified in attacking the inherent injustice of this incident, and that is what some readers with a strong sense of social justice will certainly have advocated. However, I find it instructive that this was not the approach that Jesus took. By addressing this issue at a deeply individual level, rather than taking on the system, Jesus did something very, very different. The first thing he did was to bring down the temperature of the confrontation through a classic diversionary tactic, when he bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. By means of this action, Jesus took the initiative away from the mob and shifted the focus of its attention away from the terrified woman, while simultaneously dousing the mob's anger with the psychological equivalent of a bucket of ice-cold water. Having got their attention after bending down essentially to floor level, the second thing Jesus did was to place himself once again on an equal footing with the accusers by rising up slowly and quietly to his full height in their midst. By this casual but presumably very deliberate action, Jesus transformed the atmosphere completely and now drew the focus of the mob's attention fully onto himself and to what he was about to say. Now, the ringleaders at this stage would surely be feeling the first frisson of anxiety and anticipation of a plan about to go pear-shaped. This sense of trepidation was confirmed by the third thing that Jesus did, which was to force them to examine themselves as individuals and not as a powerful mob. This released them finally from the emotional grip that the ringleaders had previously held over them. By doing this, Jesus compelled them to forget the woman completely and focus their full attention on assessing their own moral standing, by offering each of them the challenge of finding a single one among them who could lay claim to being without sin. Just one. So rather than poking holes in their failure to live out their own system of morality, Jesus ensured that the accusers understood that morality is a sword that cuts both ways. So my answer to the question, why did Jesus not tackle the inherent social injustice of this incident, is in fact that he actually did. However, it was not in the placard-waving, fist-pumping, and taking a stand manner that one might more easily recognize. The effect of Jesus's focused intervention was that the woman was vindicated in public and given a second chance. In contrast, the mob was humiliated and sent slinking off. deeply embarrassed at their hypocritical and bullying behavior. What better outcome could there be? Can you really imagine any of those men in that particular crowd that morning ever again participating in a stoning? Surely none of them would ever forget Jesus's haunting words, echoing over and over in their minds. He who is out without sin, let him cast the first stone. So back to our fascinating drama, the last thing we see at the end of the first act is Jesus returning to his scribblings as a way of ensuring that each person was now forced to look within himself and not simply act out of some leftover sense of defiance, frustration, or antagonism towards Jesus, or even a sense of spite against the woman. I believe that this act of bending down again and thereby breaking eye contact was absolutely critical in eventually bringing about the conclusion we see here. So what is to be learned here? I believe there are at least 3 lessons from Jesus here. The first, how to handle trick questions. The second, how to handle power. And the third, how to address trauma. So Jesus' lesson number 1, how to handle trick questions. Jesus' strategy was simple and consistently applied. Move the scene of the battle immediately away from where it has been staged. So in this particular case, Jesus ignored the question and just bent down and wrote on the ground, pretending that he couldn't see or hear. That completely changed the dynamics. 5 to 6 months later, in response to the no-win question of paying taxes to Caesar, Jesus asked them to give him a coin, switching the focus from the question itself to a familiar, everyday object. Once again, completely moving the scene of the battle. So I think the rule about trick questions is you are allowed to be creative. Jesus' lesson 2, how to handle power. We've already explored the way Jesus exploited the psychology of posture in the way he redirected the murderous energy of the hyped-up mob. The only other observation that is perhaps worth mentioning is that judging from the manner in which Jesus handled the situation, he must already have decided that the incident was really nothing more than a staged drama that was designed to put him firmly on the horns of a dilemma, with the woman merely as a dramatic prop. If, as the ringleaders expected, Jesus would have tried to plead for mercy on behalf of the adulterous woman, he would have been roundly condemned as a charlatan for espousing loose and non-Jewish moral standards and of being an enemy of sound family values. However, if he decided to support the stoning, he would have been pilloried for not living up to his own teachings on forgiveness and compassion, or worse, even accused of seeking to usurp the power of Rome, which was by then, in my understanding, the only authority legally permitted to carry out executions. So Jesus simply played along with the idea of a staged interaction as he looked for a way to wrest control from and turn the tables upon those directing the proceedings towards their desired outcome. So I believe the handling of power, maybe there are 2 aspects that I see here, 2 specific aspects. And the first one is, do not be cowed by the powerful. In this particular event, it is the sheer dismissiveness with which Jesus deals with this very influential group in John 8:6, when he just kneels down or bends down to write on the ground, that captures the imagination. He clearly ignores their strident accusations and clamor for his involvement in the scene that they have staged. What I find particularly interesting in this verse is the addition of some manuscripts of an explicit assertion, in some manuscripts, of an explicit assertion that when Jesus first stooped down to write on the ground, he did so as though he did not hear. While the actions themselves provide ample evidence that this was indeed Jesus' intention, I find this extra bit of explanation, albeit contained only in a minority of manuscripts, to be absolutely priceless. I can only imagine the depth of their frustration in having to swallow their pride and ignore what they would have perceived as a disrespectful slight, albeit from a recognized rabbi. How galling it must have been for them to hold their tongues just so that they could reach the end goal of finally discrediting Jesus in public. The sting in the tail must have been particularly bitter when it eventually dawned upon them that in the end, their self-restraint had been exercised in vain. The second part of handling power that I see here is, just as Jesus was not cowed by the powerful, he was gentle with the marginalized. Even as the angry mob began to melt slowly away in embarrassed silence, the woman's awful anticipation of receiving the cruel impact of that first rock that would have been thrown at her must have been still palpable. So Jesus's very gentle approach to her makes perfect sense. Nevertheless, this runs completely counter to our normal experiences in which the powerful often ride roughshod over the weak and the marginalized, and do that seemingly without a moment's regret. So the third lesson that I believe is here from Jesus is how to address trauma. As the woman eventually turned round and lifted her veil, she realized that it was only Jesus and herself in the square, presumably with Jesus's bona fide disciples, now free of any of the rent-a-crowd players in the staged drama. Surely it can only have been then that the rapid beating of her panic-stricken heart and her anticipatory nausea would have begun to subside, even though she could still not yet be absolutely sure of what precisely was in store for her. Jesus's two questions, however, brought her that final certainty. In asking the first question, "Where are your accusers?" Jesus was effectively not just asking the woman to lift her gaze, but also to take a good look around her. This would have begun the process by which her attitude would change from potential victim of violent mob justice to an independent observer of events around her. For me, the posing of this question expresses Jesus's profound appreciation of the suffocation of the immediate present for someone who has recently experienced deep trauma. In asking the second question, "Has no one condemned you?" Jesus was both completing that transformation process and drawing out of her a clear response. The effect of this would have been to shift her demeanor from that of a passive acceptance of her fate to active engagement with her current circumstances. For me, the posing of this second question expresses Jesus's clear understanding about the lasting tyranny imposed by the past upon those who have undergone significant trauma. So we have already discussed the questions Jesus asked of the woman and the affirmation that he gives her, but what are we to make of these last two commands? Understanding the first command is fairly easy. Go seems very easy. It seems very prosaic, but I believe it had a specific purpose. The first was to confirm to the woman that the whole incident really was over and would not be taken any further. The effect of this was to begin the process of restoring to the woman a long-lost sense of agency. Where she had been dragged into the square not under her own volition, she was now able to leave the square under her own steam. Jesus' second aim was to shake her out of the dreamlike state that she must have been in by then, as she readied herself for that painful, lingering death. The effect was to complete her transformation from a powerless victim whose future would be determined by others to a person with the dignity to determine their own destiny. While the first command was straightforward, I believe the second command, sin no more, is far more nuanced and rather interesting in my view. Let us therefore end off by exploring what Jesus might have really been getting at when he issued this command. So in this final question, what was Jesus trying to communicate? And what is this last scene all about anyway? Did Jesus mean, you now need to be morally perfect? Well, being a true realist, Jesus would have known that all human beings are morally flawed, in the fundamental sense that no matter what standard of morality we adopt, we will fail to achieve it. In that absolute sense, then, the command would be completely impossible to obey. So can this really be the central meaning of Jesus' command? Or did he mean, you really need to do better next time? Assuming then that Jesus was not looking for sinless perfection from the woman in future, perhaps the command was more of a final warning, with the implicit threat that this was maybe her last chance to get her act together, morally speaking. A different way of interpreting this would be, consider yourself very lucky to get away with it this time, but next time you're on your own. This interpretation essentially ends up as a threat that would hang ominously over the woman's future. As such, I do not see it as consistent with Jesus' philosophy of drawing people to him through a relevant expression of genuine compassion rather than using the manipulation of either carrot or stick. So if not the above, did Jesus mean you now have the chance to be the person you've always wanted to be? My sense is that although there must be shades of the other suggestions above, this interpretation is probably the closest to the spirit of Jesus' ministry. This understanding of Jesus' advice or command implies that the woman is being reminded of her capacity to make good choices. She does not have to continue to live under the thrall of others or live her life out as a victim. She has the genuine opportunity now to put behind her whatever it was that led to her adulterous and undignified action in the first place. She can now begin to work towards building a completely different future for herself. There is therefore no expectation of sinless perfection, nor any sense of the threat of retribution if there was ever a moral lapse in the future. Instead, there is the offer of a new and more positive direction or trajectory for her future life. My sense is that Jesus' message to this woman was the following. Just as this is the beginning of a new calendar year in the Jewish liturgy, you now have the chance of making it the beginning of an entirely new life. In a very real sense, this is how I interpret Jesus' offer to every one of us who will ever have the privilege of hearing his voice. The focus of the angry mob was without doubt firmly on the past. Look at what she's done. We even caught her in the act. However, Jesus' focus on morality was future-orientated rather than past-fixated. His focus was firmly fixed on the potential that the future holds for each one of us, no matter where our journey of life has led us so far, And his word of encouragement to each one of us is, look at what you can become. So those are my thoughts on Jesus's interaction with this woman. But I'm happy to stop and maybe open it up for anyone to make any comments or questions or suggestions.
Themba, thank you. I love the way you handled this. And it's a comment, but I'd like to, maybe you can flesh it a little bit more. You use this phrase, let's see, I don't know where it was, but you say the mob slinks off. And I was thinking about, you know, Satan and the temptation of Jesus. And I always view that experience that Satan had to slink off at that time too, after trying 3 times. So anyway, it kind of got my mind thinking that, oh my goodness, here it is again, Satan trying his best to get Jesus to sort of, as you, at your conclusion, then said, this is what you gave those points at your conclusion. So just talk a little bit about that imagery of the mob slinking off.
Okay, maybe it's just my my artistic temperament coming, but I think that what you have said has made me think. If you think about this incident, ostensibly it's about these people attacking this woman. So maybe this woman must have upset somebody or something, and maybe because it was dawn, maybe she had been sleeping in somebody's place, or somebody had set this up. And then later you say, actually, the woman is just a prop. And then you say, it's actually just an attack on Jesus and his ministry. And yes, it is. But I think what you've just pointed out is, behind many of these interactions, we get so caught up because we see the people. And we don't see that actually it's part of a spiritual war. So Jesus defending this woman and setting her free is actually a part of spiritual warfare. You know, we sometimes think of spiritual warfare in many different ways. And I think the slinking off, I agree with you that in that sense, it is Satan slinking off, because he was trying to destroy our means of salvation. And Jesus saw right through it. So I think that actually is an important point. We sometimes get so caught up with the human beings in front of us that we forget that actually there's a spiritual war going on behind. So thanks for that.
Themba, thank you so much. Just, just as a sort of preamble, I just want to say, it's just, as you've sort of portrayed this whole scenario, it just, I feel overwhelmed, because it's just such the power of God. The power of Jesus is just so evident, you know. But just as you were speaking about Jesus, when he spoke to the woman and said, sin no more, I reverted right back to where Jesus said, the first one to throw the stone, they must look at themselves. And I sort of tied the two, I connected the two. And I wonder if the woman had connected the two. I mean, I'm sure she was an absolute, as you sort of said, her mind must have been an absolute turmoil. And
no, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think maybe what I picked up from your question, it's almost also, if you imagine the woman, yes, she would have been in a turmoil, but in her mind, she might have been, had a real bone to pick with those men, if you like. And I guess the other side, I think, from your question I'm picking up is, it's almost like Jesus is saying, you can be better than them. You can be better than that. You don't need to sink to their level. Because I can imagine as she left that place, she'd be vindicated on one level, but she would probably be very resentful. And perhaps when Jesus says, go and sin no more, he's saying, I'm calling you to something much higher. You don't need to stoop to their level. You can live a life that's much freer. So thanks for that.
We have something from Thandi Gamedze. She might be slightly familiar to you, Themba. If you look at the chat, if you had to make a guess, what would you say Jesus wrote in the sand? And in the meantime, we've started a sort of a parallel conversation there. They often wonder that maybe he was writing some of the ringleader's sins, and Grant says those who were accusing her of the sin, or the names of the sinners. Okay, shall we move from the chat back to Themba? Your thoughts?
But actually, I actually had included that in a first draft, but I decided not to go deep into it in case it distracted everybody completely. It is an interesting question. As a small aside, not too long before Jesus was ministering, there was a person called Honi, the circle maker, who was known as a prayer warrior. He was a Jewish religious person, and he's famous for praying for rain. There had been no rain for a long time, and apparently he sat somewhere and he drew a circle around himself, and he said he's not leaving the circle until it rains. So you can read about that, which is interesting. So the drawing in the ground was something that made me think about him. But I think it's fascinating whether Jesus wrote anything discernible down. One could think maybe he wrote particular sins. Yes, he could well have done that. He could well have been just doodling. So if you think about the scene as a dramatic scene, you imagine this crowd has been hyped up, right? And they want to put Jesus under pressure. And so as Jesus faces this mob, he realizes that if you were to actually respond to them, whether just by, words and stuff, there's no right answer. And so he takes this thing away he takes the initiative away. And I think there's two ways. You could say he wrote something down which started to look like people then started thinking, oh, maybe there are other sins as well. This is not the only sin. But it could be that he was just getting them to realize that something else was going on here, just doodling. If he had been writing something specific, maybe John would have hinted it. So we really don't know. But all we know is that it changed the dynamics. And maybe that's the core thing that we need to remember, that when we're in a really difficult place, the comment that was made before, we're in a spiritual battle. And in order to fight that battle, we need to be in touch with God, to be able to draw from him the ability to change the dynamics. Because there are certain dynamics with every situation. And somehow, God has given us a way of totally transforming the dynamic. So Jesus did that, and it could be that he wrote something very specific, but it could be that he was doodling, and then everyone is looking amongst themselves. What's he doing? What's he on about? Why doesn't he respond? What is that? And suddenly, the focus on the woman had gone. So it's one of those fascinating questions.
Thank you, Themba. Just to bring things up to date a bit, two scenarios I'd like your input and thoughts on. The one is this issue of hate speech. And speaking as a white male who's a hetero kind of male,
yeah,
I'm very aware that anything I say about women or about gender issues, I'm likely to wind up under heavy accusation and opprobrium from crowds wanting to stone me.
yeah.
And I see that happening around me.
Yeah.
I'd like you to talk a little bit around that. And then another issue, which has a different slant on it, is living now in South Africa, where the lid has come off huge and unacceptable levels of corruption where public officials and businessmen have been caught not just with their hands in their till, but their snouts in the trough, and badly disadvantaging the whole nation by the pillaging of the nation's wealth. And people are waiting to see people in orange overalls and being what's the word, charged.
Yeah.
We want blood, or we want to see action.
Yeah.
But nothing is happening, and then people try and make excuses. Could you,
Yeah.
maybe comment on those two issues?
Okay. Whew, good questions. Deep, very deep questions there. I can maybe say a couple of things. These are very weighty questions, and I don't want to take up all the time. But I do feel for you in terms of the way in which power has been used and abused in the past by men, and sometimes by white men, have actually taken away the ability of somebody like you to make any contribution in that space. So that is very painful. And the only thing I can say is, I remember when I was young, I was involved with a Christian group called Scripture Union, and we used to go on camps and so on and so forth. And I never forget, one of the first things that we were taught about sharing your faith was win the right to speak. And it's something that's sort of grown on me over the years. We sort of have this idea that we're free to speak to anybody at any time about anything. But there are certain situations where our contribution actually will not be helpful. And if we really want to make a contribution, unfortunately, the sins of our fathers, we sort of have to, in a sense, pay for them. We have to go through this period. So it could be that that is not your battle, or it could be that it is your battle, but you're going to have to suffer to be able to enter that battlefield. So it's unfortunately just one of those things where one generation has stolen from its children. And I think that's what's happened here. Our forefathers, our male forefathers and others, in the way that they have treated women, have sometimes taken away our right to be able to interact on these matters. So it's a difficult one, but I think this is exactly where Jesus's ability to change the dynamics comes into being. I don't know what that will look like, but that's the only way possible. Any way of engaging directly with those situations probably is going to end with you being stoned, as you say. And in terms of the corruption, so what I think you're saying here is, let's substitute the woman for these people who have been corrupt and who have destroyed our nation. And is it the same thing or not? I think on the one hand, there is something that is similar, but on the other hand, the big thing that's different here is power. The woman was powerless. She didn't wield any power in her society for many reasons. But the people we're talking about have wielded real power, and they've abused power and, in a sense, destroyed our nation. So we do need to protect our nation from such people. So definitely there is a place for justice, but I think what this particular story is about is sometimes it's easier for us to extract justice from the powerless and to leave the powerful to go free. So we definitely need to address this issue of what we do about the powerful. Of course, part of the problem is that these things do take a long time. And my hope is that eventually we're going to actually see justice, and we're going to see the leadership of our country being basically challenged, that if you mislead, if you destroy the country, unfortunately the country will have to move you aside and bring in leaders who are righteous, which is in line with God's authority. So I think the power aspect is the big difference here.
Just a question, or perhaps a realization around the nature of the discourse that we're involved in. So Jesus was set up to step into a trap to pick sides.
Yes.
And there's no right or wrong.
Yeah.
And that sounds very familiar. That's the nature of the discourse, certainly social media and so on. There's shaming, whatever end of the spectrum you're on and so on. And just made me think, what is our role as Christians in the middle of such discourse?
Yes. That's an excellent question, and I remember once having and other people have probably had this, the idea of Christians as a bridge, and a bridge between two opposing sides, and this is the life of a bridge is actually pretty painful, because if the two sides are pulling apart, the bridge has to stretch, and the bridge in war, for example, is always the target. You don't want the enemy to be able to move around, and so you destroy your bridges and so on. So if we think about that metaphor about the two sides and us being piggy in the middle, if you like, that's one of the things we're called to be. We can never choose sides, in a sense. We'll always be in the middle. So, for example, now under apartheid, many Christians stood up and basically made it clear that they didn't believe the regime was valid. But at the same time, now that we've got a new regime, Claude mentioned corruption and so on. We're being called to stand against that as well. In fact, Christians will always, in a sense, be against their regime. We're never really to be totally supportive of any regime, because there'll always be something, some people suffering under any regime. So it's a painful place, but it's what we're called to do. We are called to be in that middle ground. And obviously we need God's strength to be able to do that.
Themba, let me ask my question, because it probably leads into some of the things on the chat. So one thing that I suppose is astounding and that you brought out very well is, had Jesus done the almost like expected sort of social justice angle on this, where's the man here, etc., he would have achieved less, whereas in what he's done now, he's achieved that and more.
Yes.
Useful in any way to almost like think through scenarios like, what would have happened had he said, "Where's the man?" Or is that actually not a useful line of thought?
Yes. Yes, I mean, that's a big question. And as Christians, we are called along. I would like to think of it as a spectrum. If you think of social justice, there's, if you like, micro social justice in a situation which we find ourselves. And in those situations, we just have to be careful that we don't approach them like the self-righteous person. Okay. But then there's macro social justice, which is God trying to restore all things back, if you like, back to Eden. So when Jesus comes, it's important for us not to be so distracted, in a sense, with some of the issues we see around us, and forget that there's a deeper battle going on, with a deeper spiritual war. I think in all these things we have our place, and there are places where it's important for us to support those who are being abused, those who are being mistreated, but at the same time to see that the one who's mistreating can be changed. So when Jesus said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," I mean, when I think about how those people will have gone, now if you're trying to change society, you actually want to change the bad people. Yes, you want to stop them doing bad things to innocent people, but you want them to somehow have a change of heart. And I can very well imagine that the next time there was any kind of stoning or whatever, we know later on in the Bible in Acts, we read about a stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. I would doubt very much that in that crowd would have been people who heard those words. And so social justice, if it's really sustainable, will change society, genuinely change hearts, rather than just simply rub people up the wrong way, make them angry, make people even more antagonistic towards each other. But it's a battle each one of us has to fight, and we always find ourselves going from the particular to the deeper, and the two have to be pulled together. If all we're doing is almost being a policeman around everybody, that's not necessarily going to help. But if all we do is ignore the pain and suffering of our world, then also that's not very helpful.
I need to get back to all the chat. So one sort of line of question is, let me read this one. How can Jesus's model be applied in taking a stand against modern lobbies for counter-biblical standards? Another comment which you can't see, activists often use the scripture in debates on prostitution, but indeed the woman was just a prop. Well argued, the focus on Jesus's compassion and redirection is so good. Thank you. Any views on the debate? So there's that sort of line of questioning. Oh, here, another one. Although we sidestep the morality debate here, what are your views on counter-biblical morality debates that are gaining traction in the country, e.g. legalizing prostitution?
Thanks. Yeah, the issue you raise is actually fascinating. The way I understand, for example, you're talking about anti-Christian lobbies and so on, and morality debates. Probably the best way I'd like to tackle this is that societies generally don't change very slowly, right? So, for example, a society's views on morality will stay more or less the same for decades. But over time, a society, for whatever reason that is interesting, and I think this actually is one of the reasons I became interested in L'Abri when I was at university. Over time, society changes slowly, and then suddenly there's sometimes some big move where suddenly there's like an enormous sea change in the way in which, for example, society views morality. I mean, I made that joke about being a heteronormal 20th century person rather than a gender-neutral 21st century person. In other words, the hang-ups of a 20th century person are no longer necessarily the same hang-ups of a 21st century person. So that's not to say whether society is getting worse or better. Society is always a mixed bag. And I think what's important for us as Christians is that we need to believe that God can move in any society, regardless of what that society looks like. So if we lived in an Islamic society, or if we lived in a communist society, or we lived in a society where, as you say, prostitution was legal, and all these things that perhaps we disapprove of in terms of creating a proper society, that doesn't stop God working. And I think sometimes we can get so distracted with trying to change society rather than trying to see how God can move in this kind of society. And it's a difficult one. If you live at the turn of the change in societal norms, it makes it very difficult. So I, for example, have had to learn a lot in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years about gender and about all these things. And I can sit here and saying, yeah, well, I was taught this and I was taught that, and I believe the Bible says this or that. But if that's not where the people are, I think that having that kind of debate about what standards they should have is actually a waste of time. What we should be saying is, Lord God, you are alive today in this society. How would you want us to reach out to this society in this day and age? And rather than, if you like, want society to go back to our comfort zone, if you like. And I think if we take that attitude, I think that'll help us a lot. Because condemning societies for whatever moral shortcomings they have is actually a mug's game. It's not really going to help anybody.
And you probably half answered the next question. Let me read it out to you. I'm interested in the change in the power dynamics, and Jesus is teaching us how to interact with power. How are we to understand power based on Jesus's actions?
Yes, it's actually a very interesting. The idea of power, I think, is really enormous, and I think that we, particularly people who are privileged, and I make the comment that privilege isn't self-aware, don't realize how much power we wield. And I think the important thing about remember, there was that comment. I think it's Lord somebody or other. I can't remember his name now. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think what's important there is to learn God's lesson. So we believe, whatever that means, that God is all powerful. Okay, we can debate what we really mean by that. But if absolute power corrupts absolutely, then the question would be, why isn't God absolutely corrupt? And I believe the answer is actually very simple. One of the answers is found in the cross. That by being willing to suffer, by being willing to become powerless, by being willing to understand what it's like to be at the wrong end of justice, God actually understands and can never be corrupt, because he knows, in a sense, he's all powerful, but he knows what it's like to be powerless. And I think that's probably the beginning of our understanding of dealing with power. So on the one hand, we are to accept ourselves for who we are. So we shouldn't be afraid. We are sons of the living God, so we don't need to worry about power. But at the same time, we should recognize that Jesus laid down his power and was willing to be weak and was willing to feel what it was like to be powerless. So that compassion, that ability to step into someone else's shoes, in a sense, is critically important. And I think what's also important is, when we deal with power, sometimes those who want to fight the status quo are simply the people at the one level down who want to take over. And many of them actually don't really care about the people at the bottom. And God's power is really about the people at the bottom. It's not about what's happening to me, but it's about recognizing what's happening to those who have nothing at all. So there's a lot in there, but I think that the important thing is to feel the powerlessness of those who are disenfranchised and to be able to identify with them. But then at the same time, to be able to look at the powerful in the eye and recognize that they're certainly not more powerful than you.
Yeah, so I'm not sure to what extent that actually addresses. I suppose we can have some comebacks on that. So one comeback,
Sure.
Yeah, but the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And then Tanya liked your idea of winning the right to speak. And she says, also be aware you might be ignorantly echoing the sins of the forefathers. We do have to protect ourselves from the powerful. No matter how right you think you are, your inability to pause and hear is what makes you wrong.
Yeah, interesting question. I think hearing, the idea of listening is important. The idea of good men doing nothing is an interesting one. And it is right because it's a scriptural, it is a scripture. But, you know, if an observer were to mark Jesus out of 10, you know, some people might not have given him high marks because he didn't go on about gender and misogyny and injustice. So we need to be careful that we don't condemn other people for doing nothing, because they're doing something, but it's very different from what we are doing. So I think it's important we've all got our particular furrow to plow. So we don't all have to be doing the same thing. I think that's one of the problems with people who have a cause on their mind. They want everybody to do exactly what they're doing. And definitely in God's kingdom, we're not sheep to be herded. But each one of us are sons and daughters of the Most High God, and we are priests in God's house. So we each have our things to do, and I think it's important that we do not expect others to be doing what we're doing just because we think it's the most important thing in the world.
This is Fred, and Themba, once again, thank you so much. I particularly appreciated your personal comments of your own journey over the last 4 or 5 years of having to relearn your semantics and definitions and connect with today's 21st century world in which we live. Going back to the end of your presentation where you gave various responses that you could see Jesus inviting the woman caught in adultery into a certain space, and you used the word trajectory. It invites such a fascinating conversation further, but rather than it being a restrictive option for her going forward, he's inviting her into the expansiveness of his amazing love and transformation, which, as you rightly pointed out, is available to us all humans. And thank you, too, for your comments about the fact that the church and the gospel is about the people at the bottom of society. And I think our president in his recent speech on Wednesday modeled that. Yes. And he does repeatedly. Every time he addresses it, I'm thinking that's a strong Christian ethos running through our nation if we are really making our actions backed up with our absolutely demonstrated actions of help and assistance to those most vulnerable. And your comments, too, about privilege versus those that we need to be caring for. I just deeply appreciate that very much indeed.
Thanks, Fred. Maybe I could just make one comment. I have said this before, and it probably talks to this issue of society and how society is changing, and how for many of us who were brought up in a different generation, we see society as degenerating. And it's the story of the person who wants to get to Cape Town. He's in the Platteland, and I think I have told you this. He comes across some farmer, and he says, "How do I get to Cape Town from here?" And he says, "Well, you know," scratches his head, looks, says, "Oh, if you go straight down this road, turn left around the mountain, then you'll see a lake, and then you go to the." Actually, no, don't do that. I'd go back along this road. You'll see a forest on your right. And then, you know what? If I was going to Cape Town, I wouldn't start here. And I think that's how sometimes we view people. Maybe they want to get closer to God, but we're saying, well, actually, no, we can't talk to you until you get to somewhere where we can handle you. And I think that's a very important point. We have to start with where people are, rather than condemn the person. Why are you here when you want to go to Cape Town? Rather say, okay, you are here. Let's see what we can do. And hopefully that's an attitude we can all hold dearly.
Themba, thank you so much for making the time and just for the way you handle as well, and just again for your wisdom in sharing and for your insights. Actually, Themba, can you lift up your book? I think you probably have it there on your desk somewhere.
I do. I don't know if it'll be backwards or forwards. Is it backwards?
It looks right.
It's called The Lonely Road. and it's just the next few events in in the gospel, and I would say it starts off from the demoniacs of Gilead, or the guys that the guy who said his name was Legion, and then goes all the way through to Martha and Mary, one of my favorite stories. So it's in the same sort of mode. It tries to bring to life the events. It tries to bring the different flavors that are talked about from the different gospel writers, and just tries to give us perhaps a more 3 or 4 dimensional view of Jesus. But ultimately, the idea is to make sure that we understand that the gospel is as relevant to us today as ever. And if we try and trap the gospel in how we understood it before, we sometimes lose the dynamism of the issues that Jesus dealt with. So hopefully it's around. I've got copies, and I'm just going to check. Maybe I'll touch base with Thorsten about where you can get it.
It counts as an educational book, right? So right now you are providing an essential good.
I hope so.
Themba, again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's very odd giving a one of these talks, because you don't get any feedback, so you think you're talking into the void. So thank you very much for the feedback afterwards, which made me think that, well, actually, I am actually still dealing with people, real people.